जिस देश में विश्व की 18% आबादी रहती है, उस देश ने कोरोना पर प्रभावी नियंत्रण करके पूरी दुनिया को, मानवता को बड़ी त्रासदी से भी बचाया है।
It's a story of poor public policy and complacency going back decades. It's a story of the inability of the Indian state to show up when the Indian people need it the most.
On Saturday, India saw the world's highest ever case tally of over 400,000 infections.
Are we likely to see a peak soon, or are things likely to get worse before they get better?
I don't think from the very beginning we've ever had an accurate picture of the virus in India, and we certainly don't have an accurate picture now.
आज भारत दुनिया के उन देशों में से हैं जो अपने ज्यादा से ज्यादा नागरिकों का जीवन बचाने में सफल रहा है।
This really was the first tragedy that I've ever seen that's played out so close to me on my social media feeds. People in their own close networks of family and friends crying out for help on their social media feeds. I mean, it can't get any closer than this.
India is no stranger to pandemics, but modern India has escaped some of the worst pandemics the world has seen. For example, the previous version of SARS, India pretty much escaped that. So it's fair to say that India didn't really have any competence to deal with global pandemics of this sort.
आज रात 12 बजे से पूरे देश में
India was one of the first countries to actually impose a very, very strict nationwide lockdown. I remember Prime Minister Modi came on television at prime time and said within 4 hours the country will be locked down effectively from midnight.
संपूर्ण लॉकडाउन होने जा रहा है।
The urgency behind the lockdown left many people with a lack of preparation. India has a massive internal migration. Waves of people really flow from the villages. So suddenly, when factories were ordered to be shut, millions of people were rendered unemployed virtually overnight. Then we could see waves of these internal migrants on roads, trudging back to their villages on foot. There were extremely sad and grim instances where they were so tired that they chose to sleep and they were run down by trains and buses. The predictions were for the worst sort of carnage in India. However, as the pandemic kind of ran through the population, India's mortality rate ended up being among the lowest in the world. Everyone around could see people affected by the coronavirus. Even if they went to hospital, they would get out of hospital relatively soon and relatively healthy. And here we are even talking about people aged 70 plus, 75, 80 and older.
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of theories whether India had reached a level of herd immunity at that point. There were other theories going around like India's a warm country, whether South Asian populations were more genetically immune or disposed to not feel the worst effects of COVID, but none of them were particularly well proven, but the official numbers were kind of showing that there was something going on anyway. You saw Modi at the World Economic Forum saying that India had basically contained the virus and had saved the world from corona. The central bank itself, the Reserve Bank of India, came out with a really quite jubilant statement in January saying that the country had bent the virus curve like Beckham, which was obviously a very odd statement to come out for a central bank, but that was the kind of atmosphere at the time.
You had cinemas opening, you had the wedding season started, and you had these mass weddings, these huge, beautiful Indian weddings with, hundreds and hundreds of people. And all of this was done without that very clear public health messaging that you need when you're in the middle of a pandemic. It was almost like India was an exceptional country that didn't succumb to a pandemic that was affecting the rest of the world. What became clear very quickly was what we had suspected all along and what many epidemiologists had been telling us, which is that India had been severely undercounting both its infections and its deaths. We know that many deaths in normal times in India aren't properly recorded. particularly when you get into the hinterland, which is where 70% of India's population live. Something like only 20 to 30% of deaths are properly recorded. So the government engaged in a lot of grandstanding about how fabulously it had done, and yet what happened turned out very differently indeed.
This really has been the first major global crisis that's played out since social media became such a huge factor in people's lives. And particularly in India, social media has caught on in the last few years. There are 500 million WhatsApp users. But what happened was real crowdsourced chaos that was playing out on social media. There was misinformation about fake COVID cures, immunity boosters, herbal concoctions that could save people from getting COVID. Dab some lemon juice on your nostril and you'll be safe.
ये प्रिवेंशन भी है, ये ट्रीटमेंट भी है, और ये आफ्टर जो कोरोना के इफेक्ट्स है उनको भी डील करती है. तो सारे रिसर्च पेपर 25 रिसर्च पेपर हमने इसके ऊपर पब्लिश किए हैं.
The problem is that a lot of people that use social media have gotten onto the internet very, very recently. So it's really difficult for them to distinguish what's fake and what's real. Facebook said it had removed 12 million pieces of misinformation relating to COVID globally, from its network. But that's really a drop in the ocean considering how many millions of misinformation pieces are still floating around the cyberspace. So a lot of that misinformation has actually come back to haunt a lot of Indians during the pandemic.
The fact is that India has over the years converted itself into a powerhouse of vaccine creation. In fact, more than half of the world's children are inoculated with a vaccine developed in India. And therefore, this one particular company, the Serum Institute of India, which is situated just outside Mumbai, was seen as a hope for the world, not just India.
Adar Poonawalla is the CEO of the Serum Institute of India. And he's this 40-year-old son of a billionaire father who founded this company in the 1960s. In mid-2020, Poonawalla signed a deal with AstraZeneca to supply 1 billion doses of its vaccine for the world, and 400 million of those were meant to be produced by the end of the year. Now that didn't really play out as things went ahead. By January, it transpired that only 70 million of those doses had been produced so far. And in the start of January, there wasn't a huge amount of demand in India because basically there weren't that many cases. And all the while, India's government was sending tens of millions of doses out overseas. It was engaged in COVID vaccine diplomacy. It was really trying to sort of needle China, which was attempting to do the same at the time as well.
India has exported or donated more than 60 million doses of coronavirus vaccines to countries far poorer than India. It was seen as a massive diplomatic victory for India's ruling party. Little did they know that a more potent strain of the virus was at the same time brewing within the people in India. So there were various consequences of India emerging relatively unscathed from the first wave. One of those was the sense to be self-sufficient.
कोरोना संकट ने हमें लोकल मैन्युफैक्चरिंग, लोकल मार्केट, लोकल सप्लाई चेन, इसका भी महत्व बराबर समझा दिया है.
Prime Minister Modi imposed massive taxes on imported goods.
लोकल ने ही
Unfortunately, some of these goods that were imported were stuff that's essential for our scientists' labs to test the virus. The second mistake that was made was the calling for elections And not just elections, but massive public rallies, some of them led by Prime Minister Modi himself. The next rung of mistakes that were made was giving the green light for massive religious ceremonies, a sure shot recipe for a super spreader. The next problem that local authorities point out is over-centralization of powers within the Prime Minister's office, including how oxygen will be shared between the states. This really has proved to be a game changer because every time a state fell short of oxygen, it lacked the powers to go out and get it for themselves.
One of the scariest things when the second wave hit was the fact that India was running out of oxygen.
Sometimes this is working, sometimes this other cylinder is finishing.
I visited a private hospital in New Delhi where they didn't know from one day to the next how much oxygen they were going to receive, when it would come and how long it would last. And they had dozens of patients on oxygen and relying on that oxygen to stay alive.
I get maybe around 50 calls every day. Somebody asking for beds, somebody asking for cylinders, somebody asking for drugs. We don't have anything available and patients are dying.
Now, India produces more oxygen than it needs. The problem is that most of it is produced in the eastern part of the country, which lacks supply links to the rest of the country. On a typical day when it's business as usual in India, hospitals will place a standing order, but when a situation breaks down the way it did with the panic of the second wave, supply chains completely get eradicated. And that is what India saw. What this led to is it led to black marketing. The hospitals had certain contractual agreements with oxygen suppliers, but there were always people willing to pay more for that. As a consequence, we are in this terrible humanitarian disaster, really, where people, the citizens of India, have had to plead for oxygen on Twitter.
It was an unprecedented situation, really, in India, that so many so-called privileged people found themselves suddenly in the same boat as very average Indians, all fighting for that one oxygen concentrator or that one last hospital bed that one particular hospital had going. And it was really a free-for-all. While people are looking at social media hoping to find that lifeline, oftentimes social media has actually increased the trauma for families of patients because they end up calling dozens and dozens of numbers and then find that, they've lost precious time. And there have been instances that I know of where patients have passed away because the network hasn't quite come through. The asymmetry, I think, has been particularly stark during this crisis, that people who don't have access to the internet or don't have a smartphone where they can WhatsApp somebody to ask for something, then they've been kind of really left out of this whole fight for resources. They don't even get a chance.
What we were seeing is people lying in beds, people being bundled into any possible vehicle that was available because ambulances were in short supply, and being taken to hospital for just that instant hit of oxygen that could possibly prolong their life. What we saw was heart-rending messages on WhatsApp where families were telling other relatives or their friends, "My loved one has died," which means that the hospital now has a bed available. You can take it. What we saw was reporters going out on the field, going out to crematoriums and saying that the government has told us 40 people died in the city today. I am showing you, my camera is showing you that 500 pyres are burning right now. What we had was crematorium workers telling us, "I will go to hell if I lie to you and tell you that this is not as bad as it sounds."
We went to one of the main crematoriums on the outskirts of Delhi, which is on the banks of the Ganges River. There were so many pyres burning, the heat was extraordinary. And of course, instead of the normal morning scenes that you would have, All of the relatives are in full PPE and no one can hear each other through the masks and over the sound of the fires burning. It's traumatic enough to have someone that you love die, but to not be able to save them and to try so hard to do it is just absolutely agonising.
So when people started asking for vaccines urgently, India just did not have the supply to give them. The country of 1.3 billion people, which had so generously donated vaccines to countries far poorer than itself earlier, suddenly found that their own population was effectively naked. It lacked the protection that even a single dose of the coronavirus vaccine could offer.
That's a big irony, is that you've got the world's largest vaccine producing hub, but it isn't able to supply itself, let alone the rest of the world. So many of the poorer and middle income countries that were dependent on India supplying the COVAX initiative, for instance, that's just not going to happen for a while, and they're really, those countries are the ones that are going to be very hard hit by this. And at the same time, I think a lot of Western countries are being criticised for not sharing their vaccines, particularly of India and others as well. So you're really seeing this as a kind of part of the picture of the wider sort of global inequality that we're seeing around vaccines.
Some of the poorest and the most vulnerable sections of society probably lack even the basic health infrastructure that is a human requirement. It's a basic right. But probably for the first time, the so-called privileged in this country are facing what the poor Indian faces every day, that not even money can buy you a hospital bed. And really, the second wave of the coronavirus has exposed severe cracks in Indian society, in Indian policy making, in India's healthcare system, that are essential to be filled if we have to go ahead as a nation.
When cases started shooting up and there were thousands of fatalities, a lot of people on social media networks called for Prime Minister Modi's resignation. And then the next thing you heard was that the government had asked Facebook and Twitter to take down those posts. But there were also instances where social media networks just took down these hashtags on their own and then came in for huge criticism because they were acting really out of turn, because they were actually stifling people's criticism of the government and of the Prime Minister in handling this massive tragedy.
This has been the single biggest failure of the Union government in the last 73 years. And 73 years is since the independence of India.
So we can see the political impact of Modi's popularity being eroded probably for the first time. As people die, as people realize that privilege no longer protects you.
Prime Minister Modi was elected on a massive majority in 2014, and he repeated that in 2019. He came in on a very business-friendly platform, and he has made some considerable reforms in India, like a momentous decision in 2016 to demonetize part of the currency and basically ban 86% of the currency overnight. And it didn't seem to affect his popularity at all. So he's used to being the leader of the country that talks to people about really big picture issues and almost on a religious level. So I think he thought he could float above COVID. But the fact that no family in India has been untouched by this epidemic, everybody knows somebody who's sick or who's died. There's no way that the government can hide from the impact of this virus. And as one analyst said to us, you can explain away bad GDP numbers, but you can't explain away a dead family member. That's not something that the government is going to be able to cover up.
It's unclear yet, though, whether his support has really been dented in the long term. Elections are still, years away. So it's really yet to be seen if this is a turning point in Modi's support, in his political narrative, whether he can come back from this.
B.1.617, the variant of the novel coronavirus, first sequenced in India, is fast spreading across the world.
If Indians are not vaccinated quickly, if India doesn't do everything to contain its spread quickly enough, the risk is that more and more of these mutations could threaten not just the health and livelihoods of the rest of the world, but also immense economic supply chains. India contributes more than 8% to global growth. But if you integrate what India does into the systems of the world, into large banks, into large pharmaceutical companies, most of the seafaring ships which haul cargo from one country to the other, most of these ships are manned by Indians. What will happen to the supply chains around the world if Indians are unable to get up, get out of their beds, go to work, be healthy, think, be on their feet, enable that business continues as usual?
As India's power and stature has grown over the years, as it has taken on more and more leadership roles on the global stage, world powers, in particular the US, is very reliant on India as providing a kind of buffer against the rise of China, in particular in the Asian region. It's really important that as a democratic country on the border with China, India maintains a strong global role. And if it's unable to get this pandemic under control, if it's unable to boost its health infrastructure enough to create a stable environment and therefore allow its economy to recover from the lockdowns, then that global stature that India has will be under threat.
It's a lesson not just for policymakers in India, it's a lesson for leaders everywhere about the areas of policymaking that need focus, about what could go wrong with just one single decision. That a tiny virus, unseen by the naked eye, can take down strongmen all over the world if they're not careful.